Hey there, guys. Brian here. Just a reminder that you can now support The Other 51. If you go to patreon.com/theother51, you can find out information there on how to make a donation or become a subscriber. Again, that's patreon.com/theother51. Thanks. Now on with the show. Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, conversations with writers of all genres about writing. I'm Brian Moritz. Today's guest is novelist Rebecca Makkai. Rebecca Makkai, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for chatting with me.
This is a big thrill. As I was just saying, I discovered you as a writer this past summer when I picked up your short story collection, Music for Wartime, completely at random at the library before I went on vacation. And it was the last book I read on vacation, and I was like, "What is this magic?" I've since gone back and read every your other two novels, and looking forward to the one coming out. And I'm super excited to talk to you about this today.
Thanks. That's really brave of you to pick something completely at random for vacation. I would be that brave, because then you're stuck with it.
Well, it was funny because I had two books that I knew were pretty much gimmies that I was going to like or that I was going to go through. And so I'm like, okay, it was something, I don't remember what struck me about the book, but the title or because it's funny because I'm not usually a short story reader either. Yeah. But it's something about that and I'm like, this sounds interesting. I'm going to give this a go. And sure as heck, it stuck. So.
Oh, that's so cool.
So, before we talk more about writing, when I was doing research for this, for today, I noticed in your bio that, you were a Montessori teacher for 12 years, was it?
I was, yeah.
I love it because my daughter was a Montessori kid when she was in preschool. She did I think 2.5 years of preschool before she started kindergarten.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, I was teaching much older kids actually.
Okay.
A lot of people Montessori just as a preschool program, but it actually, the curriculum is designed through high school. And I was teaching, for most of my time, it's mixed age classrooms, but it was basically 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And I went to Montessori through 8th grade myself. I'm a total devotee. My kids are there now. I love it.
So what I know about it, and you said most people know about it, like from a preschool perspective, but what does a Montessori classroom and what's a Montessori curriculum look like as you get older into middle school and even high school?
Yeah. Well, okay, so elementary school it's a lot of tactile, materials, but they're very connected to what you're learning. So abacus type materials for math, for instance, that then you sort of slowly transitioning onto paper to the abstract. Or how if you say something like 7 squared, it takes people, sometimes it doesn't quite sink in necessarily right away that is literally a square shape, like 7 by 7. So they have 7 by 7 squares with beads that you can count, and there are 49 beads. So, you're 7, you're 8 years old, that's what you're doing. But by the time they get to middle school, high school, it's definitely textbook based and, science lab based and all that. It's just, they're still working at their own pace, doing a lot of independent study stuff, all that. So it's lovely.
Yeah. Why is that? Why did that stick with you, do you think?
Well, that's the way I was educated. I really, until high school, I didn't have a graded test. I didn't have homework specifically. I, wasn't really told what I needed to study. And there are minimums, you gotta cover, some stuff that would be irresponsible to let you graduate without doing long division. But, in terms of I want to do a report on this one artist. I wasn't being assigned, everyone pick a name off this list and we're all going to do a report on an artist. It was an idea. And that's something that I think as a writer, that's an instinct that served me, habit that served me really well. I'm going to follow my bizarre passions and sink into them, do a ton of research. Doesn't matter if anyone else cares about it or not. And not going to wait for someone to tell me what to write about or look at what the market is interested in, because who cares? I'm just going to follow my own weird obsessions. And sometimes they're really weird. Writing being my life, sometimes those obsessions are going to last for 4 or 5 years as I write a novel and move to that place, basically, so that's, I probably would have been a writer no matter what, but I do think that don't know, that those habits have served me well.
Well, it does seem to serve itself with kind of creatively minded kids and creatively minded people. Certainly my daughter is like that. She's into theater and music and writing and all of that. And I do wonder if there is something, you may know this having taught and been around that, a connection between Montessori education and a more creative mindset.
Yeah, I think that it's great for every kid. I don't think it's like those are the only kids who do well there, but I think it brings out, creativity in whoever. So, you get things like both of the Google guys were Montessori kids. And, you might agree or disagree with what they're doing, on a their lives. But, those were people who were probably always very math and tech minded, but then they went and did something super creative with that. Right. Whereas you get, someone who was probably going to be an artist anyway, and then you put them in Montessori and they're just like pig in mud and they don't have that miserable experience of trying to sit still in a desk for 12 years. So that's too,
So I wanted to ask too, kind of as you were teaching Montessori, you were also, I assume, writing your early work. So what was that part of your life? Like, how did you balance teaching full time and trying to write full time until you went full time as a writer?
Yeah, thanks for asking it that way. 'Cause it's so funny. Like my first novel appeared during I kept teaching like part time for one more year. So the kind of, my first novel was appearing right as that ended. And I got all these questions from people like, why did you suddenly decide to stop teaching and suddenly start writing? It's like, how long do you think it takes you to write a novel? All these short stories come out this entire time. Like, what do you think I was doing? No, I originally only planned to teach for like 3 years, but it turned into 12. The whole time, I was writing short stories. I was poking away slowly at first on my first novel, The Borrower. Towards the end of that time, I really picked up speed on the novel, found an agent, all that stuff was happening while I was still teaching. But, I will say that at first I didn't have kids. So I was teaching and then writing, and I had my summers to write. I had Christmas break. I had, Montessori, you don't have homework to grade, which was lovely. So I had like 4 p.m. till whenever every night. I was still exhausted constantly. It wasn't, it's not like I came home with a ton of energy because you've just been with children for 7 hours. But, then towards the very end of that, I had kids and I was trying to write and I was trying to teach full time, and that was a bit much. I would say now, I still teach. I do a lot of, I'll teach for a semester here and there in different graduate programs. I'm the artistic director of a place called Story Studio in Chicago, which is a nonprofit writing center. So I do a lot of teaching, but even though I do much less teaching than I did when I taught full time, the fact that I have kids now on top of everything else means I actually have it's much harder to find time to write than it was when I was teaching full time with no kids.
Right. So, I mean, how do you do that then? Between teaching, between being a mom, having your family, and writing's your job too. So I'm always curious, like, how do you structure your days? How do you structure your time to be able to write and edit and do whatever you need to be doing in your writing life?
Honestly, most of my teaching gigs are evening, whether it's adult writing classes or grad school classes or whatever. That varies a bit. This semester I have a visiting chair at Beloit College in Wisconsin, so those are daytime classes. But usually, I'm teaching, a couple nights a week, and in the meantime, I'm reading student manuscripts. So I drop my kids off at school, and some days it doesn't work out like this, but at least a few days a week, I now have 7 hours where they're at school, and a lot of other stuff needs to get done in that time. If I have a doctor's appointment, if I need to exercise, and all of the just endless mountains of email that come with both my writing career and my teaching. But on a really good day, I can, go do some yoga and then go to the coffee shop across the street and sit there for, 3 or 4 hours and write or edit or, whatever it is. And that's a good day. And not every day is a good day, but in my mind, that's how I do it.
When you, I try to do the same thing, but I'm a library guy instead of a coffee shop guy for the couple hours.
Yeah, Yeah, sometimes I am too. Yeah.
So you're teaching now. Congratulations on the visiting chair at Beloit. How much does teaching, does it at all inform your writing at all?
Yeah, definitely. It, I think if nothing else, it helps you articulate your own aesthetic. It helps you articulate, things that bother you, that you see a lot in other people's work that you might also be doing in your own work. I think it's important for every writer, I think, at different stages of their career to be reading work that isn't quite there yet and to be articulating why it isn't quite there yet. Whether that's because you're teaching or because you're in a workshop yourself, looking at your peers' work, or because you're reading submissions for a literary journal and deciding what stays and what goes. But partly troubleshooting again and again someone else's work and starting to get those muscles in really good shape. Also to see what's sort of a writerly cliche that you might not realize. So I'm always pointing out to my students, for instance, the number of stories that start with someone waking up in a bed.
Okay.
And looking out the window and looking, just there's a lot of looking then. Sometimes they're like dust mote in the beam of sunlight from the window. And if you hadn't read that 100 times, because really successful published books probably aren't going to do that. And if they do, they're going to do it in some brilliant original way. But you read enough really good, but not quite there yet, student work, contest submissions, journal submissions, whatever it is. And you start to see that, like, oh my God, 17% of the stories that people are sending into this journal start with someone lying in bed looking at stuff. And you are going to know to stay away from that yourself, because even if you could do it in a beautiful way, do people do, and then you're going to send it off to, say, the Kenyon Review. Does the editor of the Kenyon Review want to see another story where someone wakes up in bed looking at the dust motes? Probably. I mean, I don't want to speak for the editor of the Kenyon Review, but I'm going to say probably not, right? And even if the rest of the story was brilliant, you're putting yourself at this disadvantage, right? So things like that. I wouldn't say that I get ideas, from teaching. It's not that kind of help for my writing,
right?
And even if I did, I couldn't be able to use it. It's my student's idea, but just, that keeping those critical muscles alive, which are much more handy for editing than for generating new work. But, writing certainly helps with that. I mean, teaching, right? Writing too, but I meant teaching. Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you read students' work or read other work that's not quite there, can you think of a time when you've seen a writerly cliche that they've done that you've realized that you've done, or like, oh, I'm trying to do this too. Oh, shoot. Now I see why this isn't working, or something like that?
I specifically, early on, I was probably 24 years old. I was in a workshop myself. I was at the Breadloaf Writers Conference as a participant. And I turned in a story where there were, the narrator kept recounting her dreams at various points. She kept telling us about her dreams. And I thought that was totally fine. I thought they were really interesting dreams. And someone in the class then said, well, as if everybody knew about it. Well, everyone knows you're not supposed to write a dream. And then kind of asking the workshop leader, why is that? Why do you think, and suddenly we launch into this whole discussion. We leave my story completely behind. I was really ticked off. I wanted to talk about the story. And, this apparently, it was new to me at the time, this apparent universal knowledge that you're not supposed to write about dreams. And I didn't get it. I was like, this person's wrong and this is stupid and we shouldn't make rules like that and whatever. Cut to 10, 15 years later, I'm constantly telling my students, it's really hard to pull off a dream in fiction. And here's why, because I've seen it so many times. I know now the answer, which I don't think was articulated in that original workshop. Nothing can really be at stake in a dream. Nothing can really happen. No real change can occur. So we're just listening to someone's dream. It's as boring as when you have to listen to your friend's dream in real life. Nobody ever cares. It's the person who has the dream, right? And I've seen it so many times now in fiction, hardly ever working. I would have to sit here for a while to think of an example of a dream in fiction that really worked. Maybe the end of Donna Tartt's The Secret History. There's a dream there that works pretty well, but like it's really damn hard. And I think that's something that I'm still tempted to put them in my own work. I just cut one out I cut one down at the last minute in my new novel. I had kind of a longer description of a dream, and I was like, I can't do that. And I cut it down to maybe half a sentence, He dreamed about X, but it wasn't, I was containing myself because I've, seen this pitfall before.
Right. So that's a good segue to the new novel, The Great Believers, comes out in June, right?
Yeah, June 19th.
Awesome. Very excited about it. How excited are you about it?
So excited. So far, because nothing, it's like this lovely period ahead of time where nothing bad has happened yet. So it's great. But I did get my first review, which was a really lovely review, starred review from Kirkus, one of the important pre-publication reviews. So that kind of made me really happy. This feels really different for me. Just the heft of this book, for me, and it is a big book, but I mean sort of emotionally, it's about the AIDS epidemic in Chicago in the 80s. And then it's partly set in contemporary Paris, where a woman who lost her brother back then is sort of coming to terms with her life. And so I think, it matters more to me, I think, on that level of the subject of the book than anything I've written before. And then people just seem more excited about it, which makes me really happy. And every author thinks the last thing they wrote is the best thing they wrote. So of course I feel that way, but it's really gratifying to hear other people react the same way. Which of course means that I have unrealistic expectations and all kinds of, there's no place to go but downhill from here. So, what could possibly go?
At the risk of asking, one of the questions that you're going to be asked a billion times in the next few months with the book coming out, but writing about the AIDS epidemic, I mean, I'll get away from the why that, but what about that time and place in Chicago specifically, drew you into, like, what about that lends itself to you for this story?
Yeah. Well, so, I do love writing about Chicago, which is my city. And it's funny because really early in my career, I kept feeling like, and I'm talking about when I was like 22, I kept feeling like in order to be a serious writer, I had to write about New York, which I'd like been to twice. I had no idea what I was talking about. And quickly realized that I could and should be writing about Chicago, which I love passionately. The story evolved from very different places. It felt a little bit like a river finding its own bed. So I can't quite say how or why, I decided to write about specifically the AIDS crisis in Chicago, but I can tell you that, a source of initial discouragement and ultimately a great source of, inspiration for me is the fact that there has been very little specifically written about the AIDS crisis in Chicago. Mm-hmm. I went to the library expecting there to be entire books about how AIDS hit our third largest city. And it hit Chicago pretty hard. And there are chapters in books about Chicago history. There are chapters in books about gay Chicago history specifically. But there is, as far as I know, and I spent 5 years searching. So, as soon as I say this publicly, someone's going to be like, well, didn't you know about this book? But as far as I could find, and I asked everyone, there was no actual book, nonfiction, which is what I was looking for, about the history of AIDS in Chicago. There's one short documentary film about the founder of ACT UP in Chicago. But there's no film either. There's some fiction about it, certainly. But nothing that was going to give me the information that I was looking for. So I have not written that book. I've written a novel, and someone still needs to write that book because the history of AIDS in Chicago is kind of fascinating and very different from New York and San Francisco and LA, which is what all the books are about. Chicago had a little bit more time to prepare, for one thing. I don't mean the city. Unfortunately, the city didn't do much, but I mean, grassroots level. they had more time to prepare, because it hit a little slower. It really started on the coasts. So that was interesting. Also, the gay population of Chicago, still is somewhat, but was incredibly concentrated in this one neighborhood called Boys Town, which is exactly what it sounds like. And was large, but centralized. And because of that, everyone knew each other. All these businesses, that are all right next door to each other on the main drag. So the grassroots stuff that was going on was really incredible, was really heartening to read about. There was a hospital in Chicago, Illinois Masonic, still is there, but they had, these two doctors who I then ended up interviewing for my research. They're wonderful people. They started, the AIDS unit at Illinois Masonic, which then became a model for AIDS units around the country. There was still plenty of horrible, horrible crap happening in Chicago, from the government and the police and citizens and everything. But there was also this, kind of wonderful banding together and doing things that, I know it's not entirely unique in this story, but that to me is something very special about Chicago. So my research for this book was largely one-on-one because there weren't, entire books to use for resources. I did a lot of reading back issues of gay weekly newspapers, for the entire time I was writing about. But then I mostly was sitting down across from people in coffee shops and bars or in their own homes and, listening to their stories. And often we would both end up, sobbing. And that, gave me something, that gave me not just factual research, but emotional research. So I ended up being tremendously glad that I hadn't been able to hide behind books and think that I could gather everything I needed to know from a few nonfiction books. I really needed to sit down and talk to people.
That's interesting to hear that type of research. That's almost journalistic in the way that you were doing it. It was almost repertorial instead of kind of that traditional research. I'm wondering, how do you now, after you get all this research, both the emotional and the factual, how do you use that to inform your work and incorporate your work? Because you are writing fiction, so you're creating this kind of universe within a real universe. How do you juggle the two?
Right. There have to end up being so many things that you can't put in because, first of all, because there's no room for them in, this novel. And secondly, because it's someone else's story that, they're happy to share their story with you, but you're not supposed to steal the details,
Right.
So it's quite different than if I were writing nonfiction and then I could write down everything I found out. I think research for any project needs to come in layers. I don't feel like I'm alone in that process where, I might start writing a few pages without knowing anything about what I'm writing about. But then if I'm writing something historical set in another country about a job I don't have, whatever it is, I need to stop and just sort of get the lay of the land in a very general way before I can then proceed. And for me, early on, that was some just initial conversations, some reading of those weekly newspapers, some Googling, finding people's, personal stories that were online. I wasn't taking a ton of notes necessarily. I was much more, concerned with just the feel of things, getting some inspiration, settings, things like that. So then I was able to go back and write quite a lot, knowing that I was going to be getting a lot of things wrong and also leaving a lot of blanks. I needed people to be in a bar. I didn't know what bar yet. I hadn't done that research. So I'm kind of, leaving the details of the bar blank or writing something down that I think it probably isn't true and putting brackets around it so I can come back to it later. Then going back and really doing sort of focused research. Okay, now I need a bar. So it's 1986. It's this street. What bar would that be? What can I find out about it? Then putting those details in. And then finally, having a bunch of filter readers, people who, were gay in Chicago in the 1980s, and could catch all of my mistakes, and just tell me, that bar, that's the right choice, but you're talking about seeing someone across the room. It was so dim. There's no way you'd be able to see a guy from across the room. The kind of thing I would not be able to find out anywhere else, and then go back and fix that. Because it was so important to me to get those little granular details right. So that someone who, and I'm sure I messed some things up, but so that for the most part, someone who'd lived through that in Chicago during that time period, would have sort of that constant sense of recognition and not that feeling of, oh God, she messed that up. That's not how it was, you know?
Yeah, that credibility that you kind of maintain by keeping that kind of keeps
Absolutely.
true to, yeah. Just by reading the little description of the book, you know, it sounds like it goes back and forth between kind of modern day and the early 80s in Chicago. And I was struck thinking about how you did something similar to that with the 100-Year House, where you kind of worked back in different times and the stories kind of interconnected. How do you structure that? How tough is that to structure and weave together?
Yeah. Well, okay. So the 100-Year House, you know, that was my second novel, and I loved doing it that way, but I could never write a book that way again. It was so hard.
Okay.
You know, it for that one, it really, you know, I'm starting in the 1990s, then I'm going back to the 50s, then the 20s, then 1900. So it's not that back and forth. And I think the back and forth structure is pretty common. That's something that we see in a lot of different books. But there are a few other books that go back in time, like the 100-Year House. T.C. Boyle's novel, The Women, does that, for instance. It's about Frank Lloyd Wright's 4 wives. But in order to write the 100-Year House, I felt like I needed to write it in the order that people would read it. In other words, I needed to write it backwards.
Okay.
But in order to write 1999, I needed to know every single thing that happened in 1955 and every single thing that happened in 1929. So I had something like an 80-page outline.
Wow.
It was insane. It was scene by scene, detail by detail, and then all the timelines and all just the math involved in that. And it catching things up to the last minute. You know, someone's walking by a statue in 1955, but that statue won't be built until 1957 because the person it's a grave marker for won't have died yet. And ultimately, as far as I know, I mean, the book's been out for like 4 years now, and nobody's brought any chronological mistakes to my attention. Thank God. But unless you're about to, you could totally bring one on me, right?
I got nothing.
But that was, it felt like doing a 300-page Sodoku puzzle. It was just, it was nuts. And I loved doing it. I really felt like The 100-Year House was the book that I wrote because I wanted to read it.
Okay.
You know, like just geeking out for my own self, the like nerdy mystery, intricate, wonky book that, you know, my favorite book as a kid was The Westing Game. Okay. And I've never gotten over it. And I think that novel was my attempt to write The Westing Game in some way. So for The Great Believers, my new one, going back and forth in time, it was much easier. I'm simply following two different timelines forward. And I initially, it was initially only going to be set in the 80s. And then I decided to add, I was maybe a quarter of the way in when I realized I needed something else and started adding in, kind of went back and started adding in these interstitial chapters that are set in 2015, which was contemporary when I was writing it. So I'm still going to call it contemporary. Although it's like a different planet now looking back. You know, in both of those cases, I just have to follow the storyline forward, and I have to know, I do have to think quite a bit about what happened in the 30-year gap between those sections. Especially, you know, all these characters that we're meeting in the 80s, what's happened to them, who has survived, who hasn't survived, all of that. But that was relatively easy to keep track of. I do love writing about time gaps in some fundamental way. And it's interesting. I think that, you know, The Borrower, my first book, was not in any specific way about time. Although I guess she's looking back from a couple of years later, but that's really not the point of that book. Most things, though, that I am obsessed with, and especially obsessed with enough to make it novel length, are very concerned with time. And I'm sort of debating at this point. I'm starting my next novel, and I have two different projects going. But again, they're really about that those gaps. How is it possible to be the same person that you were 20 years ago? That kind of question.
Mm-hmm. Any idea why? Why time is kind of that thing?
Let's see. I don't know. I mean, I live in time, but so does everybody else. So I'm not sure why it's, an obsession of mine. But I don't know. I think it's always been. I remember walking through the British Library when I was in college and seeing this quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson. And what I think it was him writing a letter to someone else about a poem he'd written. So it's a kind of an obscure source, but the sentence was, he was talking about his own character, and he said, "I dipped him into the stream of time and took him out on fire." And I was like 20 years old when I read that. And it wasn't that was like, ooh, that's amazing. That's what I want to write about. It was like, ding, ding, ding. That's what I've always been obsessed with. That's my aesthetic right there. I still don't know what that means. Like took him out of fire. I have no idea. It just sounds cool, but it just, already by mid-college when I was writing, horrible self-indulgent short stories and poems and whatever, that was already the thing that like stopped me in my tracks in the British Library, and I was like, I'm memorizing this on the spot. So there you go. I don't know.
So you're starting to work on another novel. You've written short stories. I'm wondering, is the writing process different for you for a short story or a novel? And I guess I'm wondering, like, I come from a journalistic background, so everything's kind of rooted in reporting, and something happened and I'm writing about it. But for someone writing fiction, like, you have the blank screen, the Word doc or whatever. Do you know when you sit down, like, this is going to be the start of a novel, this is a short story? How does that process work?
Usually.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. The scope of what you need to be thinking about for a novel is huge. And I'm really idea driven. I get ideas. I entertain them just mentally for a long time usually. And then, I decide I'm actually going to, commit to one, whether that's a story idea or a novel idea. But I almost always really know the size of the idea, before I sit down to write it. For instance, The Borrower, I was only working on short stories. I was very young, and I got the idea for that novel, and I knew it had to be a novel. It's about the librarian who kidnaps this 10-year-old boy. If I tried to write that as a short story, it would end with them taking to the road or something, and it would just, I don't know, it feel really...
It wouldn't be done. The story just kind of wouldn't...
No, it's a long story. I could only tell a snippet of it as a short story, and it bummed me out at the time because I was like, I don't want to write novels. What? So part of the reason that took me like 10 years to write, a lot of that time was just kind of admitting that I was like going to be working on a novel. So, whereas, I have for instance, in Music for Wartime, I have a short story about basically a reincarnated Johann Sebastian Bach living in this woman's apartment in New York City, and she starts having a sexual affair with him. That I'm not going to write that for 350 pages.
Right.
Someone could, sure. But that was not, first of all, like, I don't know that I could maintain that. It would turn into like fully doing research on this guy's life. I mean, I could, like, I start talking about it. It's like, no, I could imagine that as a novel, but not in the sort of glib, unexamined way that I was writing it, where it was just like, yep, he's here. I think, you do a novel, you have some explaining to do. And also that was not something I wanted to spend 4 years working on, that was a place that was a country I wanted to visit, not a country I wanted to move to. So, that said, I have been wrong. The 100-Year House did start off as a short story. It was basically all, the first section of that book is set in 1999, and it was a short story set in 1999 about these people living in the coach house of a large estate. And I wrote a full short story, and it just didn't work, and it was way too long. And then I kept coming back to it for a few years, and I finally realized it really wanted to be much, much, much longer. And similarly, the last story in Music for Wartime, it's a short story called The Museum of the Dearly Departed. And it's about this apartment building where there's been a gas leak, and basically everyone in the building has died almost. And people are coming in to clean out the apartments. And that was originally going to be a novel. I felt like I was going to write this apartment building novel where all these different people were dealing with grief in these different apartment units. They'd all lost their families. And I still think that would have worked, but I kind of sacrificed it on the altar of that story collection. I needed a story to wrap up that collection, and I felt like this was something that would work. So I took all the notes I'd been amassing for what was potentially a novel and turned it into a much smaller story.
What's the best thing you've read lately?
Ooh, gosh. Like I'm going to give you like the most immediate answer, which was I'm rereading, Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. And I just reread like this morning, reread the intro, to it. And she's talking about how hard it is to write. And sometimes she's sitting there and she wonders if she had a stroke. That's just her unable to, think of words. And I was laughing, and I took a picture and tweeted it out. Anyway, so that's the best thing I read today. But I'll tell you that, the book that I'm in love with right now, I'm not finished with it yet. There was a writer he was a good friend of mine named Samuel Park, who died last year, very, very young. He was 41 years old, of cancer. And he'd already had a novel out, but right before he died, he finished his last novel. And it's called, I'm going to mess it up and tell you that it's either called The Caregiver when it's the caretaker, or The Caretaker when it's the caregiver. So I'm going to walk into the room and tell you, because it's a brilliant novel and I don't want to get it wrong. It's The Caregiver. See, I was going to say Caretaker. There we go. The Caregiver. It's a beautiful novel. Sam was his parents were Korean, but he was born in Brazil, spent his childhood there, and then grew up partly in California, became a professor in Chicago, which is where I knew him. And it's just brilliant. It's not out until late this summer, I believe. But I'm lucky to get an early copy, and I'll be able to write something nice for the back of the book. And I'm just madly in love with it. Of course, I'm a little biased. I was predisposed to like it, but I didn't know how brilliant it was going to be, and I'm gobsmacked. So I hope everyone listening, when that comes out, please look for it.
Awesome. Well, speaking of writing on the book, on the cover of books, I've been in a reading rut lately, but the best thing I've read, kind of going back a month, was Lost Almost by Amy Knight, which I got, again, I picked up because I grabbed it and it looked cool, and I saw that the blurb on the cover was from you. I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to like this. I've got to give it a go. So, and
it's good.
I think I know I've said this on this podcast. It's a book that I loved so much that I read it slowly. That I forced myself to read it it's a very small book. I think it's 150 pages, but I read that very slow because I didn't want to leave that world and that family. It was so brilliant.
Yeah. She, the reason I blurbed it is that I picked that, as the winner of this contest from, Engine Books, which is the small press that published it. I had agreed to be their contest judge, and they sent me 3 finalists. And, it was so funny because I was sitting there and I read hers first, and I loved it so much. I mean, it's about a family, sort of surrounding this one scientist at Los Alamos. It's like if Cat's Cradle weren't really racist and sexist, and also, sorry, I'm not a huge Vonnegut fan. Anyway, I loved it so much. And then, I finish it, and I pick up the second manuscript, and I'm glaring at the second manuscript, and I'm like, please suck, please be awful, please be terrible. And then of course the second one was great, but I still was so in love with the first one. And I started to realize, I was like, if I feel this strongly about it, that I'm actively rooting against the other manuscript. probably this is going to be my winner. I did, I did read the other two, which were indeed fantastic, but that was the one that I was really happy to, it was this wonderful, position of power actually in this great way of, being the one who says, yes, this is going to be a book. Which, if I'd chosen a different manuscript, it would have been a different story. And that's felt lovely. And, I hope that book has a nice long life and that she has I hope she's at the start of a really big career.
Rebecca, if people want to get information on you, on the book, and follow you along, where's the best place they can do so?
Yeah, well, okay. So my website, I really should update my website, but it does have the new book on it, definitely, and a lot of links to order it and all that. Twitter, though, is a pretty great place to follow me because I'll always put all my stuff on there, and my Facebook account is pretty. Who knows what's going on with Facebook?
The less we say about Facebook, the better. So.
Oh, I know, but that's a thing too. But yeah, the Twitter, I'll always put everything on Twitter, so you're not missing everything if you're only following me on Twitter.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.